Hey folks, I'm Chuck Black. We're doing 52 weeks of Python in 10-minute sessions. This week's topic is YAML. So the idea is, how do you get data that's in a string but in YAML format into Python data structures, and vice versa, take Python data and write it out to YAML string, which can then typically be written to a file. We'll be using these functions, safe load and dump, in order to do that. We'll be looking at code that does that and what YAML looks like. And so yeah, let's get started. So converting Python into YAML and vice versa. So looking at this data here, you can see that the Python data is formatted with these nice special characters, square brackets, curly brackets, etc. It's not the way that it is in YAML. YAML is much more concise and not as verbose. In order to represent a list like you see here with multiple devices, you use a hyphen, and these are the two devices that we're looking at. In order to represent what was called an object in JSON, is called a dictionary in Python, is just using the colon and specifying the key on the left and the value on the right. And so you can see that it is represented in this way, nicely indented, so at least you can follow what is going on. But you can see that in general anyway, the data over here is the same as the data over here. And so the way that we actually do the translation from YAML to Python and Python to YAML is very similar to what we did before with JSON. We do a load, and it's actually, we need to use a safe load in order to go from YAML into Python, and in order to put things from Python into YAML, we use dump. So we're not using there's no S at the end of it. And safe load we use because of the way that YAML works. Some of this stuff can actually be macros that can be executed. If you don't trust the source of this YAML file, then you probably want to do a safe load so that nobody injects something mischievous or actually harmful into their YAML data that will cause your program to crash or do some other type of damage to your software. So to give you a bit of context, I am comparing this YAML example file, which is what we'll be looking at this week, with the JSON example, which we did in the previous lesson. And if you look at these two, they're virtually identical up to this point. That is effectively the same as this right here. The only difference is that in my situation over here, I'm using JSON library, and over here, I'm using the YAML library. So YAML, I'm doing a dump. JSON, I'm doing dump S. And when I do end up reading it in, I'm using safe load instead of load S. Other than that, it's the same, except for there's a little bit of stuff at the bottom which I added because it's possible to have your YAML data in a little bit alternate format that looks sort of like JSON. And so we will look at that if we have time in this lesson. But I wanted you to be aware that it's pretty much going to be the same as what we did in the last lesson that we did, which was on JSON. So since I've said it's exactly the same as what we did with JSON, I'm going to breeze through this. What we're going to do in this code, as I mentioned, we're using this YAML package. We are going to get the inventory from exactly the same location and use the same inventory data. We're going to open up a file for writing, and we are going to dump that inventory into that file. So we're converting it into YAML format, and we're writing it out, and then we're turning right around and we're reading from that file, and we're reading the data in. Now, YAML inventory at this point in time, it's just a string with YAML data in it. I print it out. I go through this double load and then dump in order to print it out again. So we saw how that happened. The main crux of what I'm doing, though, is because I've written something out and now I've read it back in using these YAML mechanisms and translations, I am going to read it in. I've already read it into YAML inventory. I'm going to do a load of it to get it from the YAML format into Python format. And then here's my if statement where I compare what I saved and I've read back in with the original, which is that inventory thing that we started with. And if it works, I print out that it works. And if it didn't, I print out that it didn't. So let's run it and see what happens. So as you can see, here's the output of the program. As you recall, I print it multiple times. The first time I just printed out in the format that it was saved in. The second time I'm printing a pretty version, which is where I have used an indent of 4 and it actually prints it a little bit more to my liking. And then the last thing here, the thing that we were looking for, is to make sure that the data is actually the same as the data that I read in originally. And sure enough, it is. So let's move on to the alternate format real quick. So this is the alternate YAML format. If you look at these credentials, this is how we have done them before with just keyword and value pairs using the indentation and new lines, etc. It is possible to do it slightly differently, such as you see here. So in this situation, I've condensed everything onto one line and I've put password and then the password value, username, and the username value. And when we look at the code that actually deals with this, I deal with it exactly the same way. I open the file, the file that we just looked at, and I read it in, and then I'm going to translate that into Python. This is the saved inventory alt, and then I do my if statement, and this shows in the output that it actually looks exactly the same as what the original inventory was. Here is what I'm reading in and then translating it into Python, and here is the result of my comparison, and you can see that it's equal. So an alternate way to do YAML stuff. So let's review YAML. This is what it looks like. You use the dashes to indicate a list of some type, and you use colons to represent key value pairs. And we will be going to and from Python, and the way that we do that when we're going from YAML into Python is we do a safe load, and when we want to take Python data and write it out into a YAML string, then we do a dump. The code that we were looking at looks something like this, basically the same that we did before. We open a file for writing, we write out this inventory data, and then we read it back in. And the crux of this whole thing is that we're going to do our loading of the data that we read back in, and we're going to compare it with the original. And so when we wrote it out, we did a dump. When we read it in, we did a safe load, and then we compare it to see if it's the same. Last thing that we did was a little bit of dealing with the alternate format for storing YAML data, and the way that we can read that is exactly the same as we did it before, and we showed that that works as well. Hopefully this makes sense. If not, let me know, and thanks for listening.